So let's dive right in to how like his policies and his administration are impacting people because or will impact people. Because like I don't know about you, Nathan, I keep seeing this point from like Republicans, from like left leaning people, like whether they're apologists or people that are kind of just trying to turn down the temperature, like artificially turn down the temperature. Like I feel like there's a lot of people that are like, hey, we can't freak out about everything. We have to pick and choose our battles, and therefore like we have to focus on how on like the limited impact of the things that he's doing, and how like yes, it'll like his policies will affect maybe the government and the country, but really politics is local and they're not really going to affect you individually in your life very much. And I think that's often true. Like I think it is often true that like who is in the Oval Office has an effect on a lot of people in a broad way, but not so much an acute effect on like literally your everyday life. I think that is not true in the case of Trump specifically and all of the actions they've taken so far, because their actions have been so broad, so poorly executed, and so like wide sweeping,
Yeah. There are so many things that the federal government does actually do that you might not notice, you might not think about, because it's just the way that it's always been. But as soon as that shit's gone, you will notice. Like you will
totally
see it.
And fundamentally, it's the people in the government who are doing those things. And I know we talk about this sometimes, like civil servants and like administrative agencies and executive agency stuff, but like really, really critically, it's like actual individuals working together in government to keep the lights on and keep everything functioning properly in ways that we might not even notice. And that's what they're going after and trying to undermine.
Yeah, like these massive layoffs that they claim is for, fraud and abuse. These are people that have critical functions. There are approximately 2.4 million members of the civilian federal workforce, which wouldn't include the military. Like, just talking about the civilian federal workforce, and there has already been thousands upon thousands of layoffs, firings, forced resignations. In several different agencies that we rely on.
Their stated goal, is to cut 10% of the federal workforce. Right. So like imagine, listener, like the group of people that you work with, and just take 10% of those people away, and imagine that you're still going to be doing the exact same job to the exact same quality. No, it's not possible. It's not how like life works. So 10% of the federal workforce. The other thing is, I thought this was really useful. Let's just dispense with the idea that this is the goal here is to like really fix our budget deficit. All of federal employee compensation makes up only 6.6% of the overall budget. So even if they cut 10% of the federal workforce, we're talking about like less than 1% of the federal budget that could be saved here. This is not about deficit spending. This is not about the federal budget. It is just not an impactful area. It's about dismantling the functions of government that we all need. So like, let's just get it out out front that like, this is not a budget conscious action.
And let's just look at some kind of some industries or some organizations that are being cut from, and talk about how that's going to affect everyday people. First off, I think it's important for us to talk about the Department of Veterans Affairs, because everybody knows a veteran, right? There might even be some people who are veterans that are listening to this pod. I know a ton of veterans, and the thing is, both Republicans and Democrats always pay lip service to veterans.
Yes.
And both Republicans and Democrats rightly point out that the way that the VA is currently structured is flawed and inefficient. And that's absolutely true. They have systems, technological systems that haven't been updated in years, in decades.
Yep.
That is absolutely true. But the other thing is they also have a shortage of staffers.
Yes. They're chronically understaffed. Famously
understaffed. They're famously understaffed.
Yeah.
So then here Trump comes in. Not only has he cut multiple workers from the VA, he has also instituted rules that basically say that for every one person that they hired that's new, they have to lay off 4 people.
Jesus Christ. Just permanently crippling them. There's no way they can recover from this. It's impossible.
Yeah. Which means that the life-saving care that the VA already struggles to get to people, which is health services, mental health services. You know, when soldiers are stationed overseas, and spouses need help being able to get a job because, you know, maybe they're in an area where they don't speak the language, those job services for the spouses so that the families can actually stay together for our troops, that goes through the VA. Yeah. Those services go through the VA.
Yeah.
Now, there's this Rolling Stone article that I was reading about this that was actually making the argument that maybe this is actually by design, because the idea is that if you cripple the VA so badly that veterans just have no choice but to go to a private plan, then that might just be by design, because ultimately these people don't believe that the government should have any hand in paying for your health care. They don't believe that the government should provide any services in terms of health care, that all of that should be handled by the private sector. Yep. So, you know, you might think, well, you know, maybe they cut these people not realizing it. It's entirely possible that they knew damn well what they were doing, and it's by design. They want to make sure that these people are so fucked, they have no chance but to turn to the private sector.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And these are veterans, right? Like, we can't overstate that enough, that like these aren't just your random Joe Smo people. These are people that served our country who are the victims of this particular action. And Nathan, I think the point you made is so important. Like, it's clearly not about deficit spending. It's about a philosophical approach to government, in that they think the government should not functionally exist and provide services to people in general. Like, if it were, you know, about budgets, they would cut, you know, larger like areas. Like, if it were about the biggest agencies or biggest sources of spending, they would go and cut large parts of the government, as opposed to the tiny agencies that actually generate more revenue generate more returns than they cost. Like, but fundamentally, to your point, Nathan, it is about forcing the government out of being able to function and provide things to our citizens, and therefore creating this vacuum where the private sector takes over, right? Things like let's spend a minute talking about like the Forest Service and like the National Park Service as an example.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a good example of how dereliction could potentially lead to like what they want, which is again, like, you know, the private sector being able to move in and take over stuff. So the Federal Service and National Park Service, they obviously manage, like, they're separate organizations, but part of different departments. So the Forest Service manages public lands, provides technical assistance, and conducts research on this is like sustaining the health of our national forests and grasslands, right? The National Park Service preserves and manages our national parks and monuments. Both are about our public lands, which are owned by all of us and we all benefit from. The National Park Service, for example, provides, accepts 325 million visitors per year. Like, that's essentially the population of the United States going to our national parks every year. And they were forced to fire 3.4 thousand people and rescind job offers to another 2,000 seasonal hires, plus those who will take the buyout. And so basically, like, they are significantly cutting out the people that it's not like the Park Service has a ton of admin people that are getting cut out. No, these are people that are actually on the ground running these parks and conserving these public lands, like literally providing emergency aid to people that get stuck in dangerous situations in their parks, literally are cleaning the bathrooms and emptying vault toilets, and basically just making it so that these national parks can be utilized by the public and be an area of like, you know, enjoyment for the public, right? On top of that, a ton of wildland firefighters have been fired and or not rehired. So federal agencies, employed 17,000 wildland firefighters last year, and they're going to rescind job offers to thousands of those people, which we anticipate will literally contribute to forest fires. So why do this, right? Aside from just like saving money, why would they care to do this? Well, if we can, and this is conjecture, but it's consistent with kind of what we'd expect from this administration and their perceived motives, including the fact that they have literal oil lobbyists in like heading up these agencies around conservation. If you make it so that these public lands are so poor, like so neglected and so unusable and so crappy that no one wants to go and experience them and enjoy them, then no one will be there to protect them from leases for extraction of like fossil fuels and minerals. Like no one is going to protect and conserve these public lands. And so ultimately it's a long game to be able to just turn them into like whatever, the large purchasers of land want to do to like extract timber and natural resources from our public lands.
Yeah.
And that means you individual, just to like go back to the theme, making sure we're anchoring these back to like how this is going to impact you. That means that you will not be able to go and experience some of the most gorgeous and majestic things that our incredibly beautiful nation has to offer. You will never see like animals in the wild that are endangered. You will never be able to like hear some of the calls of these gorgeous birds that are out there. You'll never see these huge mountains. You will never see these trees that are hundreds of years old and tens of feet in diameter at the bottom and hundreds of feet tall. You'll never be able to experience that awe-inspiring like experience of being in these public lands. And it's totally tragic.
Yeah. Another important thing that is going to affect you, and this is something that Michael and I have talked about before, but I just want to make sure to reiterate it. Let's not forget that the reason why Trump won to begin with was because prices were too high. Groceries were too high. Yeah. And he's smart enough to know that that's why he won. He has said that several times, and he's absolutely right. The reason why he won is because prices were too high. Well, we have to recognize that the tariffs that he wants to implement. Now, you might say, well, hold on. A lot of the tariffs that he was saying that he wanted to implement on like Canada or Mexico or whatnot, like he's rescinded those. Those were actually just threats. All right. Yeah. Those were just threats. He was never actually going to do it. He said that he temporarily was going to rescind the threat. All right. He didn't say that the threat was over. He said he was going to temporarily rescind the threat. Yeah. And it is still his plan to implement across-the-board tariffs. Now, we have talked about on this pod before that when it comes to tariffs, the entire point of them is to raise prices. And sometimes targeted tariffs, that can be a good thing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if there are industries where the United States has a market that directly competes with another country to provide that same good, if you implement a tariff, then that incentivizes consumers, or rather producers in the United States, or consumers, to buy specifically from that American company. Mm-hmm. Because, it's a better deal. Because the people that pay for tariffs are not the exporters, they're the importers.
Yeah.
Right? So a retailer is going to have to pay that tariff on that imported good from that other country. And of course, they're going to put that cost down to other people. Mm-hmm. And if other people see a price where it's like, here's this item, let's say it's from China, here's an item, this item is from the United States, the item from China costs significantly more than the item from the United States, you're going to go with the item from the United States, which means that the real retailer is going to also be more likely to just buy the item that everyone else is buying because they don't want to pay more money and you don't want to pay more money. Mm-hmm. But the reason why across the board tariffs make no fucking sense at all is because the entire point behind the tariff is to raise that price to disincentivize people from buying from that other country. Mm-hmm. It is not to raise revenue. Yeah. In fact, if it raises revenue, the tariff's not working. Because if it's raising revenue, that means that people are buying the thing anyway.
Yeah.
So either it works, which means it's raising the prices, or it doesn't work, and generate some revenue. That's how tariffs work.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, once those tariffs are in place, that is going to drive up the price of everything for you. All right? That means that those grocery prices are going to tick up more than they were before. And we're already starting to see like an increase in the price of eggs. Now, to the extent to which that is directly related to Trump's policies, I'd say that's a little bit unclear at this point. But like the fact of the matter is, he has not fixed those prices like he promised he was going to.
And his policies will make them worse. Yeah.
And his policies will make them worse.
Yeah.
And that will affect your everyday life. That'll make it more expensive to live in America. It'll make it more expensive for you to just get the basics that you need.
Yeah, totally. And to your point about like the foodborne illness, like that's another thing that we just take for granted from the government that we don't even notice when it's working, right? Like right now, right? We've got this incredible, historic levels of like bird flu, right? Yeah. And the way we experience that, to your point, Nathan, is like through the price of eggs. The way we do not experience it is through illness, because we have a functioning government that is out there ensuring, like administering regulations and ensuring that like egg producers are not, are like eradicating this illness, right? And so and so it's a slap in the face during this period of incredibly high, avian flu, that even the FDA, and we should talk through the other departments of the Department of Health and Human Services as well, but like even the FDA is having their federal workforce slashed. Like the Department of Health and Human Services has fired roughly 5,200 employees as part of this. And these are people working on, improving healthcare, regulating food packaging, responding to infectious disease outbreaks. And so like on the one hand, okay, we got the FDA, right? Literally responsible for their traceback system, which investigates reports of foodborne illness, right? Which literally affect hundreds of thousands of people each year, or millions of people each year, and lead to like thousands of deaths. But this system of like getting those reports of foodborne illness and tracing that back manually, right? This is a human intensive system, manually tracing back these supply chains all the way back to the source of the illness, so it can be cut off and to end the series of sickness from the disease, right? Like this is a critical function, one that is on stark display right now that will be impacted by the removal of employees. So we can expect, you listener can expect, higher rates of foodborne illness and more deaths from foodborne illness as a result of this administration. And not only foodborne illness, all illness, because the CDC is also a target. The Centers for Disease Control, right, charged with protecting Americans from outbreaks and protecting public health, right, had 13,000 employees before the cut and is being forced to cut nearly 10% of its workforce, right?
Yeah.
Which literally includes elite teams. This is not this, like, the administration keeps claiming these are performance-based, but it is literally cutting elite teams of researchers and laboratory scientists that are like responsible for monitoring and investigating disease outbreaks, including things like rabies, dengue fever, and other diseases, right? Like they're responsible for tracking diseases that are starting to jump into humans from other species. They're tracking diseases that are turning deadly for the first time, like a disease called Oropoche, which is spread by small flies in Brazil, and for the first time last year, killed someone, which means like this is something, I don't know, we should track. Things like fighting Ebola outbreaks and coordinating like our response, like and not to mention all of the things they did to help fight the COVID pandemic. Even this organization that again is very human intensive. They have a program of like hundreds of scientists that partner with like local public health programs to fight disease. Like in the past 2 years, they have literally responded to flooding and fires in Mexico to like help save lives. They've responded to an environmental disaster in San Diego, as well as been fighting an ongoing tuberculosis outbreak in Kansas City. Tuberculosis. Like, and this is one of the agencies getting cut.
And on top of that, speaking of health, NIH grants are now on the chopping block, and this is actually something that affects a personal friend of mine who recently got laid off actually before the election and has been trying to find a job, and recently there were 2 major prospects for her, and both of them involved work in healthcare research because that's her field. And basically at the last minute, they were like, oh, sorry, well, because of this funding freeze, we can't hire you because we don't know how much funding we're going to get.
Yep.
Now, what's kind of interesting, so when I was first looking into this, I came across this USA Today opinion column where the headline read, "Trump isn't gutting medical research, he's cleaning up a corrupt system." And I was like, oh, interesting. Okay. Because I think, all right, well, it's important to always research the other side. And if there's, an opinion columnist on the other side, like, you should look at it so you understand the counter arguments. Because look, the fact of the matter is there is a lot of corruption in healthcare. And I'm sure that there's some amount of corruption in healthcare research. I'm sure that exists. So if these cuts are actually specifically targeted towards trying to prevent corruption within research, potentially trying to prevent, biases or prevent conflicts of interest. It's like, oh, well, that's actually great. Like if that's what it is, then that's actually great. So I start reading the article, and and the argument that they make in the beginning is basically that what usually happens is that these grants will start demanding more and more funding for their projects, because these are usually like grants that are a part of universities, because that frees up other money that the university can then spend on other programs, on other areas. And it was like, and these programs are just wasteful and terrible. And I was like, oh shit, they're spending this on wasteful programs, and maybe if we take away some of this funding, we can prevent them from doing these wasteful programs. And I'm thinking like, I work at a college, like I need to know about these wasteful programs that they're being spent on. Like what is going on here? The first thing that this person mentions is the pay for the president of the university, to which I was like, okay, well, as someone who works at a university, I can say that the president of the university is absolutely given the money that they deserve. As someone who works at a university, I will say that. I will say that as someone who works at a university.
Every penny. And, yep.
every penny. Totally deserve it. But I will also point out the fact that if you honestly think that this money being taken away, that a cent of that is going to come out of the president pay, bro, you come on.
Not realistic.
Come on.
Yeah.
Like, and the second thing, and you're never going to guess the types of programs that they said were freed up by this spending. You're never going to guess. DEI.
No way.
Basically the argument was that they reduced this, and these were the only 2 examples that this person provided. And I'd just like to point something out about research. I know that there is this bullshit narrative that has been put out there about how DEI is all about hiring minorities or women over more qualified men, to put more emphasis on that identity than that qualification. I know that is the narrative. It is not fucking true. Yeah. The fact of the matter is, and we've talked about DEI before, it has been well studied, well documented that organizations that have more diversity, like businesses Major businesses that have more diversity actually tends to be more efficient. Like actually tend to make more money and be better run in terms of their overall output. Now, the reason why having a diversity of people from different backgrounds in scientific research is important is because the specific areas of scientific research are often based on the people who actually research it, which means there could be an issue that affects a lot of people, but because the scientists who are researching it are not from that specific background, they just ignore it. To give you an example, autoimmune diseases are the third most prevalent diseases in the United States, like chronic diseases in the United States, the third most prevalent. And autoimmune disease research is famously, notoriously underfunded. And guess what? You are twice as likely to have an autoimmune disease if you're a woman than if you're a man. The reason why diversity is important is because you have cases like that where maybe if you had more women in the science field, there would be more of an emphasis on this chronically under-researched area that is affecting millions of Americans.
Yeah, totally.
That is why it's important. That is why it's important. So to bring this back to the whole point of this segment, these cuts will make it so that scientists, talented scientists in the United States will not be hired. The next generation of scientists will not be hired. The ones that are currently hired, some of which will be laid off, some of which will be limited in what they can do. And you know what's going to happen? Talent, both new and old, are going to go to other countries.
Yep.
And it's all because of this bullshit.
Yeah.
This bullshit crusade against DEI. And I would just like to make a comparison real quick that I think is worth making. I'm going to go ahead and break the Goldwater rule because Goldwater actually said it's okay to break the Goldwater rule when it comes to Trump. Hitler comparisons are okay when it comes to Trump. One of the biggest mistakes that Hitler made was going after and demonizing the Jewish scientists that lived in Germany. All right. The fact that he was so anti-Jewish meant that there were a ton of extremely talented Jewish scientists that ended up having to flee Germany to escape the Holocaust. And you know what those scientists did? They came to the United States. And you know what they did in the United States? They built our fucking nuclear bombs for us. Oppenheimer was German, and he was driven out. He was driven out because of this crusade against a specific group of people in scientific research and in the country as a whole. And the exact same thing is happening this time.
Yeah.
Maybe not to the same extent. Maybe they're not being hauled off to camps yet, but driving off talent because of bigotry and sending them over to other countries. This means that the United States, which has previously been a beacon of scientific research, of new medical scientific research, that's all going to be gone. We did a previous segment a while back about how every single pharmaceutical drug in the last decade at some point during the development has been funded by the NIH. Every single one. And the way that works is they fund the riskier part at the front end.
Yep.
And then the private corporations come in and they take the patents, then jack up prices on the back end after the risks have been mitigated, after a drug is considered promising. Now, that is a corrupt system, but the fact of the matter is, if you start reducing our ability to do that on the front end, to potentially research drugs that are promising, that means that there is an entire generation of drugs, of pharmaceuticals, of life-saving medical achievements that are going to be stifled because of that.
Yeah.
And
totally.
that will affect you.
Yes, it will. And that's the thing. So the actual limit they put in place here is that they're trying to implement a hard cap of indirect costs for research at 15%. Now, an indirect costs are things like, the lab where people are, or the heating, or the lighting that enables people to work in that lab. Like, it is basically anything that isn't directly, i.e. indirect, the research. But as is, indicated by the example of, the building and the heating and the lighting, there's a lot of stuff required for research that isn't the research material itself. And so the reason they're doing this 15% number is that because often private research grants cap indirect costs at 15%, which is why it's even more critical that the government allow for more than 15% because it requires more than 15% oftentimes in order to conduct this research. As a result, like research projects are going to be limited or shut down. For example, there's a neuroscientist named Rick Huganier at Johns Hopkins University who has spent 25 years working on gene therapies to help prevent certain birth defects in children, right? And his lab could have effective therapeutics for these issues within the next several years, and pretty much is like halted at this point because of NIH, because of the loss of NIH funding. At the same time, Michigan State University saying that the reduction in funding is likely going to force them to stop construction on a research facility focused on studying cancer and cardiovascular diseases, the two leading causes of death in the United States, right? And it could also cause the university to shut down its pilot initiatives to reduce maternal and infant death as well, right? So these are like literal near-term things that will push off by years our ability to fight chronic and acute illnesses that cause people suffering and death. And it's all because someone picked out 15% as an arbitrary number for how much it should cost to run a facility where research is done.